guys, it's Ty from gamesfromthefret.com with another play and learn video for the great Bloody April. This is video 4 in the series. And as a bit of a recap, first of all, I want to thank all of you for the kind words and encouragement on the earlier videos. But we are here in the final video in the series, video 4. As a reminder, in video 2, video 1, we spent quite a bit of time preparing for our scenario. We were filling out flight logs. We were setting up the weather conditions and some initial counter placement. In video 2, we primarily spent time looking at random events and our weather phase, which included the very important weather drift sub-phase where the weather was potentially pushing around our flights into different directions. Video 3 dealt with ground detection and our 3 primary basic movement types, along with anti-aircraft activations and attacks. And those 3 videos took us up through about midway through turn 6, and we are, as a reminder, using scenario 5 as the backdrop for these play and learn videos. As a reminder, video 5 had a handful of British Royal Flying Corps flights taking off from Losingham and Trezen on an offensive patrol. They had 3 waypoints up here at Hex 2302 with a waypoint down in 3108, and then completing their patrol in 2209. So 2 different legs, but in a couple of different directions. Opposing them on defensive scrambles, we had 3 different German flights. All of those were Halberstadt 2s, taking off from La Bréelle and Fallenpen. And as I mentioned, we wrapped up the last video midway through turn 6. To get to this video, I have kind of done a little bit of a time warp and played through the next 6 or 6.5 or so turns to get us in a position that we can review some other important concepts in the game. And in this video, we will be focusing on tallying, or actually kind of air-to-air visualization, which is called a tally. We'll be taking a close look at air-to-air combat, dogfighting, and post-combat rules. One thing I will point out, if I haven't mentioned it in the earlier videos, I highly recommend that you take a moment, head over to Board Game Geek, and grab Artie Morty's extended sequence of play. It's going to be a file up there on Board Game Geek. What I found when I've been playing either Artie Morty or other players, the extended sequence of play does a really great job of breaking down the step-by-step progress. Get that into your hands, keep that in front of you when you play, and that's going to really walk you through step-by-step what you need to do for each sequence in a particular turn. But again, this video is primarily about tallying, air-to-air combat, dogfighting, and post-combat. And so what I've done here, just kind of bring you up to speed on the last 6 turns. You'll remember at the end of the last video, our British flights had ended up here in the northern part of the map. They had done some basic level flight. They've got some requirements for their task that they have to stay at a certain altitude. And they ended up in this region up here by this German anti-aircraft unit. They took a couple shots from the anti-aircraft unit, came out unscathed, and then for turns 6, 7, and 8 made their way around this German anti-aircraft unit and then down towards 3108, which is the next waypoint in their task. During that time, we had the German flights taking off from their aerodromes and slowly attempt to climb to a height or an altitude at which they could engage the British flights. So again, taking off from La Bréelle and Fallenpen, the Germans were in a sense trailing the British flights, but again, were really kind of trying to position themselves in a way that they could be in a position to attack later on. During that time, we did reach turn 10, and there's a specific rule in turn 10 that you do adjust or roll to see if you adjust any of your weather effects. I won't go into that rule too much because it's a pretty straightforward rule, but I will point out that during this time, our wind speed did increase from 15 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour. And so all of our flights will be facing primarily a headwind, which is really, I saw as I played out these turns, really push them around. But that really kind of brings us up to the beginning of turn 13. What we see on the map right here, take a closer look, you'll see I have our two British flights trying to make their way over here to 2209, which is the last stop in their task. They're within 1 hex of each other, which is a particular rule that they have to follow. They're basically covering for each other. Both are at altitude low +6, and then we have tailing them these three German flights all at low +5. One thing that we haven't covered in this video series, and I hope you go back and perhaps review on your own, is the time to climb rules and the altitude rules. I will point out that these German flights, even though that they're at low +5, are at 9,000 feet, while the British flights are at low +6, are at 8,500 feet. And again, I won't go into those rules here. Feel free to follow up with me separately via Board Game Geek private message if you need some details on those rules. But even though at first glance the German flights may appear to be lower at low +5, they're in fact higher because they actually have a faster time to climb. So anyway, we're here at the beginning of turn 13. And so let's work to see if we can get these German flights to engage our British flights. So we start the turn off. We start off with random events like we do with every turn from turn 2 onward. And we do have, you'll see here the flight marker is at 5, which is less than the 10 number of flights needed in the air, which would be 10 to have any type of die roll modifier. So this is a straight D10 roll, and you basically need a roll of 1, and I rolled a 7, so there's no random event. There's no weather event, which the weather events happen on every multiple of 10 for our turn numbers, so we actually had that in turn 10. So there's no weather event, but there is, as there is every turn, there is wind drift. And I mentioned that we've got a 30-mile-an-hour headwind for all of these flights. So basically all of these flights are going to get pushed back 1 hex, 180 degrees from their current location, or current facing, I should say. So let's do all of these British flights first. They're going to move back 1 hex. They're going to keep their 0.5 carry that they had with them, or the calculation allows them or would have them keep that 0.5 carry. And then the same for our German flights. Everybody's getting pushed back 1 mile, which is the scale of this map. Just as a reminder, had the British flights been pushed back into range of an anti-aircraft unit, they would have been subject to attack, but in this case they were not. All right, so that is the end of our wind drift phase. That is making it really tough for the British guys to get ahead. I've seen these flights get pushed around for the last couple turns, and it's not been fun. Okay, wind drift. After the wind drift phase, we get into ground observation. Actually, our British flights are already detected, so we don't need to worry about that. And our German flights are not within range of any of the trenches, so they are not subject to ground observation. And that takes us to really the first new rule that I wanted to cover with you that deals with visual sighting or tallying. Visual sighting is basically the way that different flights attempt to observe each other, and it is again only air to air, so air units observing other air units. The basic rule is that any flight that is within 5 hexes can attempt to secure a tally on an enemy unit, and they need to roll a 12 or higher on a modified die roll. A 20 is an automatic success, a 2 is an automatic failure. We'll take a closer look at some of the die roll modifiers so we can get an idea of what kind of comes into play here. We actually have this detection table on our play aids, and the first die roll modifier for visual detection deals with range. And so the range is simply the number of hexes, a -1 for each hex, and then additionally, if there is a difference in altitude, there's an additional -1 modifier for the difference in each altitude band. So if you go from low to medium, that's a -1. Low to high would be a -2, in addition to the number of hexes that separate the units. Flight size also plays into this. The more planes that you have in a flight, the easier it is to spot. There's a modifier for flak burst. So if you remember, when a AA unit attacks a flight, you place a air burst or a flak burst marker on the board, and then if that flight is attempted to be tallied on later, there's a modifier of +5 to the roll for that. And then finally, there's some modifiers for weather. If you're in rain or snow or fog, or if you're looking through a broken cloud, there's some negative modifiers for all of that. Remember, if the cloud cover is solid, that actually blocks line of sight, and so there's no attempt possible in that particular case. So let's run through a couple of examples. We've got a lot of opportunities here for tallying. One thing I will point out is that if an attempt on a particular flight fails, a tally attempt fails, you can actually tally or attempt to tally another eligible unit. So for instance, if the German flight A attempts to tally flight 1 and fails, he can try flight 2. There's no problem with that. You can only have one flight tallied at a time per unit, so A could have 1 tallied, but A cannot have 1 and 2 tallied. It's only 1 at a time per flight. All right, well, let's do a couple of examples here. First of all, let's do flight A, the German flight, trying to tally flight 1, the British flight. So first of all, we got to take into account some of our modifiers. There is a range of 2, 1 hex, 2 hex, so that's a -2 die roll modifier. They're at the same altitude band, low, so there's no altitude modifier for that. And then there's a flight size modifier. Normally, we wouldn't reveal this to our opponent right away, but since we're doing an educational video, we'll go ahead and take this into account. The flight 1 for the British actually has 4 FE2Bs in it, and if we look at our modifying table, 4 to 6 planes in a flight is a +4. All right, so again, -2 for the range, +4 for the flight size gives us a net modifier of +2. So we're going to roll 2d10, and I rolled a 3. So 3 plus 2 is 5, which is less than the requisite 12, so that tally attempt fails. But like I mentioned, if one tally attempt fails and there's another eligible target, that individual flight can try again. So A is actually going to try to attempt flight on flight 2. And it's going to be the same range of 2 and the same modifiers for range and flight size because flight 2 also has 4 airplanes in it. So let's roll 2d10, and that's a 5. So that also fails. So flight A has not tallied anyone. Let's try flight B. Flight B is a little bit closer to 2. Flight 2, so again, pretty much the same calculation for A. It's a range of 2. There are 4 planes in it. The net die roll modifier is +2, and B is going to roll 2d10 to see if it tallies flight 2. I rolled an 11, plus 2 is 13. So B does tally flight 2. So we actually have some counters that we need to place. So first thing that happens is I'm going to pull out some of my tally markers. So this is actually going to be tally marker B. And then we also have to do, we have to provide some information. So basically what this action has accomplished is B can visually see Flight 2 through all the combat and smoke and weather and range and everything. It actually has a visual identification on Flight 2. So Flight 2 actually has to share some information with its opponent. And there are a couple of different pieces of information that need to be shared. First of all, the number of airplanes in the flight, the type of airplane in the flight, the altitude in feet, and then also the number of damaged or crippled airplanes. So four bits of information. So let me go ahead and change the marker for that British flight. As a reminder, the British flights, flight number 2, are Sopwiths 1.5s, and that is Squadron 43. So I'm actually going to pull out a visually identified marker and put it on the map. So you'll see that this marker, this counter gives us some information. It's Flight B, Squadron 43, and this 1.5 means it's a Sopwith 1.5. So the other information that needed to be shared with your opponent in this case is that the number of airplanes is 4 airplanes in this flight. The type of airplane is a Sopwith 1.5. Its altitude at low plus 6 is equivalent to 8,500 feet, and there are no damaged or crippled airplanes. So there's a little bit of intelligence there that the German player can use to make some decisions. So let me take a break there. I'm going to finish up these other tallies, and then we're going to get into air-to-air combat. Okay, I've completed the other tally attempts for all the other flights on the German and the British sides. Flight 1 was unsuccessful. Flight 1 for the British was unsuccessful in tallying any of the German flights. All the other German flights, A and C, were unsuccessful. You'll remember B was successful earlier. But Flight 2 for the British, which has been tallied earlier by Flight B for the Germans, did successfully tally Flight B for the Germans. And you'll see I now have a tally 2 marker here, and I've also replaced the generic counter for Flight B with this Jasta 11 counter that identifies it as some Halberstadts, in fact Halberstadt 2s. Just like the British did, the German player had to reveal some of that information because of the visual tally. It's Jasta 11 Halberstadt 2s. There are 3 of them in the flight. They're at 9,000 feet. None of them are damaged. And so there's a little bit of information here, and it looks like we've got a pretty good fight getting ready to brew here. So for the rest of this video, and to demonstrate the rules behind air-to-air combat and dogfighting, I'm really only going to focus on those 2 identified flights, the Sopwith 1.5s and the planes from Jasta 11. Okay, so let's now move on to air-to-air combat. Air-to-air combat, as you can imagine, is a pretty important part of this game, even though the game is operational level. But really, I think most folks who've been following this series of videos have been waiting to shoot something. So we're going to get the chance to do that here. There are some requirements, though, if you are getting ready to attack or considering an air-to-air attack. There are some requirements, prerequisites, if you will, that you have to meet to be eligible to attack. Some of them are pretty obvious or make a lot of sense. Some of them might take a little bit of getting used to. But let me run through these. First of all, you have to have a non-depleted air-to-air weapon, which basically means you actually have to have ammo to shoot, which makes a lot of sense. You have to have a flight whose task allows it to engage. So the mission or orders that you have from your commanders have to allow you to have the option to engage. Things like offensive patrols, pretty obviously, are going to allow you to attack. There are some tasks, though, that require that you do not engage any enemies. That perhaps you're on recon or artillery spotting. Or there's other tasks that would prevent you from attacking an enemy flight. You basically have to have planes in your flight that are not damaged or crippled. If everybody's damaged or if everybody's crippled, that you are ineligible to attack an enemy. You also have to have visual identification on your potential target, like we do here. The way the German flight has visually identified the British flight, which makes a lot of sense. If you can't see your enemy, you can't attack them. So that makes a lot of sense. And then these other ones that I'm about to mention are a little bit more particular, so I'll walk through these as well. You basically have to be at the same altitude, and when we talk about altitude, we are being specific about the number of feet, not simply the altitude band or the time to climb rating. So basically, if flight B for the British is at 8,500 feet, like they are here, the potential attacker has to be higher than that 8,500 feet. And so the Germans, as I mentioned earlier, are at 9,000 feet. So they are higher. Let's see. You can also be higher in the same band or the band immediately above. So we're both in low in this case, but I could also be at medium altitude. The German could be at medium in the medium band and still be higher, but they could not be at the high band or very high band. They're basically too high to attack at that point. So in the same band or the next band up. A flight may not engage or may not attempt to engage the same enemy flight more than once per movement phase. If you fail an engagement attempt, you can continue your movement and attempt to engage another enemy flight, provided you meet all the prerequisites that I just mentioned. And if you move into a hex that has stacked enemy units, you simply declare which enemy you're going to try to engage. So in our situation, we basically meet all the prerequisites. We've got ammo. The German flight is higher than the British flight. Nobody is damaged. There's really nothing that prevents us from attempting to attack, so we can continue our turn and move into the movement phase. Since we do have British flights that are over the trench lines and a couple of other conditions, we are no longer moving everybody on one side. We are now drawing chits. We are doing chit activations. And the German player always gets to declare whether they want to move first or not. And in this particular case, clearly I want to move first because I don't want that British flight to get away. So I am going to pull a small size chit because I have fewer than 10 flights in the air. For my side, I pull a small chit, and the result I get is the German player gets to move one flight. So naturally, I am going to move this Yasta 11 flight to attempt to engage flight B. At low altitude, Halberstats have a movement speed of 3. So I'm well within range, and I'm simply going to move into the hex with my target. Moving 1, 2. I'll do a simple free turn there at the end. You'll remember that even though my movement points available was 3, you can move up to 1 less than your maximum, which I've done here. So I've moved into the hex with my potential target, and I meet all the qualifications for engaging or attempting to engage. And so now let's walk through what you do to attempt an engagement. Okay, we're ready to make our engagement checks, which is the first step in our air-to-air combat process. And we actually are pretty fortunate. We've got a nice engagement table in our play aid. And the first thing we need to determine is what the target number is for our engagement check, which is a 2d10 roll. And the target number is based on the current detected level or detected value of the target. So for instance, we know that both of our flights, both the German flight and the British flight, have been tallied. It's a daytime engagement, and so the target number is going to be 9. There are some different values if your target is undetected or if it's undetected, but in our case, both of our flights have been detected, so the tally or the target number for the engagement check is 9. That target number is modified, the die roll is modified by this list of modifiers here, which deals with aggression values, altitude, and also some weather effects if it applies in your current situation. So let's quickly run through the check for the German player first. If you remember back all the way back to the first video, Yasta 11, our flight B, had an aggression value of +3. So first of all, they're going to get a +3 to their engagement check. The next modifier is if the target has an altitude advantage. That is not the case here. You remember the British flight is lower than the German flight, which actually plays into the next modifier. The target is lower, which is a +1. The target is in the rear hemisphere. I won't talk about hemispheres too much here, but you might remember that the German player, German flight came in from behind, so this modifier does not apply. And then all of these weather effects do not apply because we're generally playing with clear conditions in this case. So basically I've got a +3 modifier for aggression and a +1 modifier because my target is lower, for a total modifier of +4. So on 2d10, we'll roll that really quickly. And I get an 11 plus 4 is 15. So I really easily exceed the engagement check for the German player. And that engagement is a success. Let's do the same for the British player. If you remember back to video 1, flight B, our Sopwith 1.5s, had an aggression value of 0, so there's no modifier there. The next modifier is a -2 if the target has an altitude advantage, and that is the case. The German is higher than the British flight, so that's -2. And my target is in the rear hemisphere. The target came in from behind me, so that is a total die roll modifier for the British player of -3. Again, the target number is 9. Let's roll 2d10 and see what happens. 18. 18 minus 3 is 15. And so that engagement check still exceeds the target value of 9. So both the attacker, the German player, and the defender, the British player, have been successful with their engagement rolls. Okay, we've completed our engagement check, and both the attacker and the defender were successful with their engagement check, so neither side is surprised and neither side is disadvantaged. It's not unusual for you to have one side that fails an engagement check, usually the defender or often the defender. If that is the case, then the attacker would have surprise and the defender would be disadvantaged, which would then lead to some die rolled modifiers as the attack continues on. But that is not the case here, so we will play it as we rolled it out, where neither attacker nor defender is surprised or disadvantaged. Now this leads us into the second step in air-to-air combat, which is our maneuver rolls. And we actually have yet another table for maneuver. And as the name implies, this is the attempt that our planes are making to get into position to take a shot on their enemy. And so they are maneuvering into position to take a shot, basically. And so in this first round of air-to-air combat, we actually use this primary maneuver table here on our play aid. We are going to make a 2d10 roll that is modified by this list of modifiers. And then with that resulting total, we're going to compare it to the column that for the number of planes that are in our flight, and the resulting number will tell us how many shots we potentially get to take, or how many shots maximum that we can take. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail for, first of all, the German player, the German flight. So the first thing we have to determine is what is known as the maneuver differential. And so basically you're going to compare the maneuver value for the planes in one flight compared to the maneuver value in the planes of the other flight, and come up with the difference between those two. And when we talk about the maneuver value, we actually have to look at our air data cards. Remember those? And so first of all, let's look at the Halberstadt D2s down here. Remember, we're at low altitude, and this MR column gives us our maneuver rating, our maneuver value, which is a 6. We want to compare that to the maneuver rating for low for our Sopwith 1.5s, which is a 4. So what's the difference? 2. In fact, it's a +2 in favor of the Halberstadts for the German player. So again, for the German player, this first modifier on our maneuver table is a +2. The next die roll modifier is the aggression differential. And so same type of calculation, but a different metric. It's the aggression value. You remember that flight, the Jasta 11 flight for the Germans had a +3 aggression, and the British Sopwith 1.5s, our flight 2, had a 0 aggression. So that differential is +3 in favor of the German player. So we're up to +5 so far on the maneuver table for the German player. The next die roll modifier is geometry, and you'll see a note that says check the geometry modifiers below. Basically, this is asking us from what direction is the attack coming. Really quickly, if the attack is in the defender's rear or rear beam arcs, the geometry modifiers are +1 for the attacker, -1 for the defender. That is our situation. Again, remember from the move that the German player did, he moved in and came in from the defender's rear, and so gets a +1 for geometry. The German player also has an altitude advantage. Remember, they're at 9,000 feet versus 8,500 feet for the British player. So that's a +1. The next die roll modifier is for surprise. You remember that neither flight is surprised, and also the next die roll modifier is for disadvantage. Neither flight is disadvantaged. And we haven't done any disengaging so far, and this flight is not at night. So basically we have all of our die roll modifiers for the German player calculated. It was +2 for maneuver, +3 for aggression, +1 for geometry, and +1 for altitude advantage, for a total of +7. You remember that the Jasta 11 flight for the German player has 3 planes in it, so I'm going to be keeping my eyes on this 3 column. I'm going to roll 2 dice and add 7 to it. So let me go back to my die roller, 2d10, 13. 13 plus 7 is 20. In the 3 column, that is two shots. So the German players, Halberstadt Ds, have moved into position to take 2 shots on the British flights. All right, let's do the same thing for our British player in the same calculations. Remember, the maneuver differential was 2. In this case, in favor of the Germans, so that's a -2 for the British. The aggression differential is -3 for the British. The geometry is -1 for the British. The only difference is the altitude advantage. So we're at -2 for maneuver, -3 for the aggression differential, which is a total of -5. All right, -5. However, the British player has 4 planes in its flight, so we're going to look at this 4 column. Right, so 2d10 -5. Let's roll and see how that comes out. 11 minus 5 is 6. On the 4 column is 0 shots for the British player. So tough luck for the British. The Germans were in pretty good position coming in from behind. They've got better planes. They've got more maneuverable planes. They've got better pilots. So even though they have fewer airplanes, the Germans had a pretty distinct advantage for getting into position and having the opportunity to take some shots. Okay, now we move on to the shot resolution phase for the 2 shots that the German player earned through the maneuvering of his planes. We actually have a handy dandy shot resolution table. It's a 2d10 roll with only a handful of modifiers, but some modifiers that we haven't used so far. First of all, the attacker, in this case a German player, is going to have a combat value for its weapons, and then the defender is going to have a damage rating, which indicates kind of how fragile the planes are on the defender's side. So let's take a close look at our air data cards and get an idea of what we're dealing with. Our Halberstats have a firepower of +3, or a combat value of +3, and on the Sopwith 1.5, the damage value or damage factor is 0. So there's going to be a total of a +3 die roll modifier on the shot resolution table. Couple of rules around shot resolution. The attacker's shots are resolved first, then the defender's shots are resolved. If you've earned multiple shots through your maneuvering, you're not required to take all of them. If you wanted to reserve your ammo, you can decline the shots after the first one. So let's do a couple of rolls. Remember, we're dealing with a +3 die roll modifier for the first shot. For the German player, 2d10, 18. 18 plus 3 is 21 on our shot resolution table. 1 aeroplane is damaged. Okay, it's a good start. And then let's do another die roll for the second shot, 2d10 plus 3. 11 plus 3 is 14. On our shot resolution table, 14 is 1 aeroplane damaged. Okay, so that's the end of our shot resolution, at least this determining the effect at least. Okay, the air-to-air combat marches along as we move on to our ammo depletion check. Basically, now that we've taken 2 shots, we need to see if our German player runs out of ammo or how much ammo he uses. The shot depletion check is pretty straightforward. It's a 1d10 roll against the weapon depletion number, which is found on the air data cards and is also copied over to your flight log. And so we can take a look at our flight log for Yasta 11, ammo 4. So we're going to roll a 1d10 against that number. And in this case, I rolled an 8. If the number is greater than the target number, like it is in this case, you increase your depletion number by 1 times the number of shots. I took 2 shots. 2 times 1 is 1. Excuse me. 2 times 1 is 2. And so then I increase my depletion number from a 4 to a 6. If that number reaches 10 or higher, then that flight is out of ammo. If they've got drums for their ammo, they have an opportunity to reload under certain circumstances. If they don't have drums and they are truly out of ammo, they basically are done and need to return to base as soon as possible. If you roll lower than that target number, in this case 4, you increase your depletion value by 2 times the number of shots. So if I rolled a 3, which is less than a 4, which is my target number, I would have increased that 4 by 4 up to 8. So again, you're rolling only a single time, regardless of how many shots you've taken, but then making some adjustments to, or providing for a new value to be rolled against if you attack in the future. Okay, so we've checked our ammo, we've taken a couple of shots. We know that we've got 2 damaged planes in the British side, but now we need to use our damage allocation table to see which planes are in fact damaged. And when I say which planes, I mean which specific planes in the flight are damaged. So you remember the 43rd Squadron with the Sopwith 1.5s have 4 planes in them. So I'm going to pay attention to this 4 column, and I'm going to roll against that to determine which planes in particular are going to be damaged. A couple things that I'll point out before I do the actual rolls. First of all, the damage model in this game is incremental, meaning if you have a plane that is not damaged or crippled at all and takes a damaged result, they are at first damaged. If they take another damaged result, they become crippled. So 2 damages equals a cripple. If they take another damaged result beyond that, then they are basically shot down. So again, you've got this kind of incremental situation where your planes become increasingly more damaged. You can definitely skip a step in that process if you take a crippled result at first, and of course you can be shot down right away. But basically, there are no die roll modifiers. The reason that this information is important is not only for the incrementality of the damage, but also if you have certain planes that have been assigned a camera for a recon mission, you may get lucky and shoot down that plane rather than the ones that are flying for protection. So yeah, this is pretty important information. Let's take a roll here and let's see what happens. Again, 1d10 on this 4 column, and I roll a 9, and that means flight number 4 is damaged. And I will mark that on my flight log. And then for the second flight that is damaged is going to be, I rolled a 2, and that's going to be number 1. Okay, now that we have identified which of our planes in our flight, or the British flight, are damaged, there's actually one more check that we need to do, and this is the special damage effects table. Planes that are crippled or damaged are going to check against this table to see if they go into spinning flight, have a dud engine, or just simply damaged in some way. So basically you'll see there's a damage column against here. I'm not going to talk about spinning flight or dud engine in this video. So for the sake of argument, we're just going to assume that there was die rolls of 1 through 7 resulting in no effect. So basically we've got 2 planes out of 4 in the British flight that have been damaged. What's the impact of that for the future? Basically it means that those planes cannot participate in any of the maneuvering or shooting. They're basically still part of the flight, but are excluded from really taking part in the combat in any meaningful way other than being targets. Just a side note, had any of the planes been shot down through shot resolution, there is this shot down chrome table, which gives you a little bit more flavor on what happens to the flights or the planes that are shot down. The crew may be killed in action, wings may break away, things like that. But it is chrome. It really doesn't have too much of an impact, if any at all, on scoring or the outcome of the game. But it is fun to roll it. Okay, so that's pretty cool. We have just completed our first combat engagement, air-to-air combat engagement. If you're playing the basic rules, you can stop there, and basically the flight breaks up. But I did want to make a point of showing you the dogfight rules. So basically our flights need to move into the dogfight situation, or the dogfight board. Basically a way to determine whether an air-to-air combat is eligible for a dogfight, basically at least one of the flights, either the attacker or the defender, has to have ammo. In our case, both of our flights have ammo. And both sides still have to have at least one undamaged airplane. If both of those conditions are met, we go into a dogfight. So how do you set up a dogfight? Well, in the board game and also in the Vassal module, we have this handy dandy dogfight play aid. And basically you're going to take counters off the map and put them into this play aid. So let's put our German attacker in the attacker box. Let's put our British defender in the defender box. We want to place a dogfight marker in the hex that we just came from. So I'll drop this dogfight A marker or counter onto the main game map. We place the defender's time to climb counter into the altitude box. So basically we've equalized the altitude between the two, and they're going to end up, we're going to use the defender's time to climb marker. And then we also put a time marker in our dogfight play aid starting at 1. And each turn that this dogfight goes through, that time marker is going to increment. If our flights had tallies on other units, they would have lost those tallies. And then basically we also remove the tallies that are on the map for these two flights. So the tally 2 and the tally B marker go away. So that dogfight counter now represents the hairball that is occurring between the British defender and the German attacker. And next turn, we will go through the dogfight rules. Okay, I've done another little time warp to get us into turn 14. We're about midway through the turn. We're in the movement phase. I've gone ahead and moved flights A and C for the Germans and flight 1 for the British. You'll see that the German flights are bearing down on the British flight who is trying to escape back to its final target location. There have been no additional tallies, but I did this little time warp so that we could take a closer look at this dogfight A. Dogfight A is currently an unactivated marker. In this particular situation, it doesn't really matter whether the German player or the British player activates it, since it is the last unactivated marker on the board. But as such, we do have to activate it. So let's, for the sake of argument, say it's the German player's turn. He pulls a chit. It's the last unit on the board, and so we're actually going to flip that to the active side to indicate that it has been activated. So we'll take a closer look at dogfight combat. There are two primary differences between dogfighting and the earlier initial type of air-to-air combat that we looked at. The first difference that I think is notable is the fact that we actually have a check for disengaging flights. So if the attacker wants to try to escape, or the defender wants to try to escape, or they both want to stay, or some combination thereof, a declaration has to be made, and then we do some checks to see if those escape attempts succeed. The other notable difference for dogfighting is that it uses a slightly different maneuver chart than is used in the traditional or prior type of air-to-air combat that we looked at. So let's first talk about disengaging checks. First of all, the defender will declare whether they want to attempt to disengage. So they have to declare first. So they either say I'm trying to disengage, or they say that they're going to try to stay and fight. Under certain circumstances, they will be forced to try to disengage if all of their planes are damaged, or they're out of ammo, or certain other circumstances that don't apply in this particular case. But there are some situations where a disengagement has to be automatically checked for. So after the defender makes their declaration, then it's the attacker's turn. The attacker declares whether they're going to try to disengage or whether they're going to try and stay and fight. In this particular case, it does seem like the British flight is at a distinct disadvantage. You'll remember from the initial combat that 2 of their 4 planes in the flight were damaged and are therefore no longer eligible to take part in the combat other than to be targets. You also remember that they had planes that seem to be at a pretty distinct disadvantage compared to their German counterparts. The planes were less maneuverable, and they also had weaker weapons. So really, it seems like the British planes of British flight is at a disadvantage, and I think in most cases would probably try to disengage at this point. So basically, all they need to do is to declare that they're attempting to disengage. And so the first thing we're going to check to see is whether they automatically succeed in disengaging or not. And the check to see whether they are automatically successful is basically comparing the level and or dive speed of the defender and compare that to the level and dive speed of the attacker. So let's turn over to our air data cards. Let's first look at our Halberstats. You'll see that at low altitude, their level speed is 3.0. On the British side, their level speed at low is also 3.0, so no disadvantage one way or the other. But for dive speed at low, the Halberstats have a 3.5, but the Sopwiths have a 4.0. So their dive speed is faster. So when they dive, they have greater acceleration, they have greater speed, and so for a disengagement check, they automatically succeed. However, before they automatically succeed, the attacker actually gets to attempt to shoot down the planes as they're escaping. There will be some additional modifiers that we'll look at because the disengaging of the British flight is automatically successful. But again, the German player in this case does get a final last shot. We're now ready to resolve the attack by the German flight against the disengaging British flight. And we now can take a look at the second primary difference between dogfighting and the earlier air-to-air combat that we looked at, and that is the dogfight maneuver table. So basically, the combat is very similar between dogfighting and the initial air-to-air combat, except that we use a dogfight maneuver table, and I want to highlight the differences between the dogfight maneuver table and the traditional maneuver table, and we're really talking about die roll modifiers. The primary difference here is that in the initial air-to-air combat, there are some modifiers that deal with surprise and disadvantage situations. There's also some modifiers that deal with altitude advantages in geometry. Those all go away in a dogfight, because you're already engaged. It's basically the second round of combat, and all of the things like surprise and altitude are kind of out the window. So we use this slightly different table for dogfight maneuvers. And so let's take a look at this particular situation, starting with the German player and the maneuver differential. If you remember from the earlier combat, the German flight had a maneuver rating at low of 6, while the British flight had a maneuver rating of 4. So the maneuver's rating in this particular case is +2 for the Germans. The aggression differential is unchanged from the earlier combat. You remember it was +3 for the Germans and 0 for the British, so plus another +3 for the Germans. Dogfight fatigue comes into play if you've got a dogfight that goes multiple rounds, and for every 3 turns there's a -1 modifier, but we don't have that in this situation. And then the final set of die roll modifiers do apply, because you remember that the British player was successful in its disengage attempt. In fact, it was automatically successful because of its speed, so it does get this -4 flight disengaging success die roll modifier. So if you add all those die roll modifiers together, +2 for maneuver rating, +3 for aggression differential, and then -4 for the disengaging success, the German player ends up with an overall die roll modifier of +1. From here on out, the combat procedure is essentially the same between dogfighting and non-dogfighting situations. We actually go back to the table up above in the maneuver table. where we're looking at the 3 column because there are 3 planes in the German flight. You remember we just calculated a +1 die roll modifier. So let me go back to the vassal module. I'm going to roll 2 dice, and I rolled a 3. So 3 plus 1 is 4, and basically, as you can imagine, that means that I've maneuvered and obtained 0 shot opportunities. So 0 shot opportunities for the German player in this particular case. This was a pretty simple dogfight. If you've looked at the dogfight rules, they are some of the more involved rules in the game. But really, had the German player been successful in maneuvering for some shots, we would have gone through shot resolution, we would have gone through depletion, we would have gone through damage allocation, just like we did in that initial air-to-air combat earlier in the video. So really, the differences for dogfighting again are that disengaging checks and the dogfight maneuver table. In this particular case, the dogfight is over, and we actually go into a post-combat situation. When a dogfight breaks up, basically the units get taken off of the dogfighting board or the dogfight play aid and back into the hex in which the dogfight was active. They actually get placed in a particular order, and the order is the defender, the attacker, and then finally a bouncer. We haven't talked about the bouncer in this rules, but the bouncer is a potential third party that may enter into a dogfight. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and remove this dogfight marker from the board. Again, the defender gets placed first, and let's get them headed in the direction towards their last target location on the map, the last part of their offensive patrol. And then let's actually keep the attacker moving in the same direction. Perhaps they can engage again later in the combat. The defender was successful with their disengagement, and so they actually do not scatter. The dogfight is broken up, but basically the defender is headed in the direction that they intended. But we cannot say the same about our attacker, so we actually have to check for scatter, in this case for the German flight. So let's go back to our play aids, and there's actually some dedicated play aid space for scattering, and you'll see it here at the top of this particular screen. Basically, we've put the attacker facing in the direction that we want them to face, but because of the chaos that surrounds a dogfight, they may not end up facing or in a location in which they desired. So basically, the way that the scatter works is we're going to roll a 1d10, and we're going to compare it to actually this graph over here, and we're going to actually place the resulting die roll will indicate which direction we're facing and also which hex that we land in. So let's go back to our board. We'll roll a d10 quickly, and we get a 7. So a 7 is off here to the right of your facing, and going back to the map, we're actually going to move. I take it back. We're facing a hex side, so let's look at this one. Off and to the right. So the German player actually is going to end up in this location and actually adopts the facing had they moved directly into that hex. The facing is pretty important because I think that gets overlooked many times. But again, the British player is successfully disengaged, and so there's no scatter for them. They are facing the direction that they want to go. Okay, there's a few more steps that we have to do to get through post-combat. The first thing is we have to determine the altitude at which these flights come out of the dogfight. And basically the rule is that they can come in any altitude that is equal to or less than the altitude at which the dogfight just took place. So if you remember from our dogfight play aid, we were at low +6, and let's simply have those flights come out of the dogfight also at the same altitude. They could have gone as low as low plus 0, which would have been in the same band, but still less than the altitude at which the flight took place. There's also a rule within the scatter chart that if the roll is odd, the flight descends an altitude band to that altitude band plus 0. So for instance, we had just rolled a 7 for the German flight, so that rule would apply in this case. And so instead of at low plus 6, the German flight comes out at deck plus 0. So again, if you roll an odd result on your scatter roll, you come out altitude-wise at the altitude band below and then at plus 0 within that band. So let's make that adjustment now. I'll have a deck altitude marker and I'll remove the low altitude marker. Okay, so our altitude is set. Final couple things for us to do for the post-combat phase. Both of our flights get maneuver markers. And we're going to check on the wind up table. So basically, this is kind of a morale check for our flights to see if they stay on the map or try to head home as soon as possible. So we actually have a chart within the play aids for this. You'll see this wind up table over here. There's a couple different columns. There's a wind up column for AA combat, and there's a wind up column for air-to-air combat, which we'll use in this particular case. You'll see that there's some modifiers to the die rolls. There's an aggression value, there's surprise, there's disadvantage DRMs, damage DRMs, shot down, etc., etc. So let's do our die roll our wind up roll for our German player first. You remember their aggression value was plus 3. They did not have surprise in the dogfight. They were not disadvantaged. There were no planes in the German flight that were damaged. They did not shoot down any enemies. They did not disengage. And they are not a single airplane. So really the only modifier that applies is the aggression value. So it's a plus 3. It's a 2d10 roll. So let's do 2d10. 14 plus 3 is 17. And that is greater than or equal to 10. And so the result is no effect. So they're going to stay on the map. They've still got some ammo. And I imagine on subsequent turns that German flight is going to look for some more targets. Let's do the wind up roll for the British flight. We're going to take their aggression value, which is 0. They did not have surprise. They were not disadvantaged. They did have 2 planes that were damaged. So that's going to be a total of minus 2 DRM. They did not shoot anybody down. They did disengage, so that's an additional minus 2. And they're not a single aeroplane. So the total die roll modifier for the British flight is minus 2 for the damaged planes and minus 2 for disengaging. That's a total of minus 4. Let's roll 2d10. 17 minus 4 is 13. And again, that is no effect. So the British flight passes their morale check. The last thing we'll do in post-combat is we will make the flights that have just split off or ended the dogfight, we will make them undetected. And so basically the visual identification for these flights go away. So we actually are going to go back to our original generic markers. You'll remember that the British flight was number 2 here. So I'll put them on the board in the location and facing for the previously identified flight. And then for the Germans, we will do the same thing. And if I remember correctly, their generic marker was for flight B. So if they were going to be part of combat in the future, they're subject to all the air-to-air visual identification, all the ground observation rules, just like any other undetected flight. Okay, so there's a lot of steps there. There's a lot to get through in a combat. what I found when I was playing is that it really took me maybe 3 or 4 attempts or individual combats to go through before I really got it. And to tell you the truth, we really only scratched the surface. There's a lot of different possibilities and combinations that can go into play here as far as who engages, who disengages. Does somebody bounce into the dogfight? Does someone have rear facing machine guns? There's a lot of different things that can go into this. I probably have shown you the most basic situation possible here. That wasn't necessarily my intent, but we are playing one of the more basic scenarios. So really this was a single flight versus another single flight, but I think does highlight the basics of combat and the basics of dogfighting. So hopefully with that under your belt, you can go on and learn the rest of the nuances of air-to-air combat and become pretty proficient at it. So that's the end of this video on air-to-air combat. I really want to thank you for taking the time to watch it. Again, we really appreciate your feedback and any comments that you have on it. This also wraps up the Play and Learn series that I've put together for Bloody April. We've really covered a lot of ground, all the way from the basics of setting up a scenario to weather effects to movement, and finally here with air-to-air combat. We really, if you add it all up together, there's about a little more than 2 hours of video content in this Play and Learn series, and so I really enjoyed putting it together. I really enjoyed sharing what I think is a tremendous game. I've got some other videos up on my blog and on Board Game Geek that are the review for Bloody April, some of the after action reports. So there's a lot of material here that I think is available to you, that I've put together, that other players have put together, that I hope you take advantage of, because Bloody April is one of those games that I think can be a little bit intimidating at first, and I think has a little bit of a reputation for complexity. But as I've said in other places, I think instead of complexity, I like to say that it's a very robust game. There's a lot of detail, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of variability to the game. For the game itself, any particular rule isn't all that complex. There's just a lot of game there for you to take advantage of. And so if you like something that's got a lot of depth to it, I think Bloody April is going to fit the bill for you. And hopefully these videos have helped you get into the game. I encourage you to seek out other players. There's a pretty active community that you can find on Board Game Geek and other locations for playing via Vassal. I hope you do get the opportunity to play face to face, because that is a lot of fun. But overall, it's a great game, and I've really enjoyed sharing it with you. And thanks for watching the videos. Check out my blog, check out the other videos, and thanks for watching.